Five young men who would change the world met in a room that smelled of sweat and leather. It was February 18th, 1964, and the Fifth Street Gym in Miami Beach was about to become the most unlikely crossroads in entertainment history. On one side stood Cassius Clay, 22 years old, days away from his first heavyweight championship fight against Sonny Liston. On the other stood John, Paul, George, and Ringo, the four young men from Liverpool who had landed in America just 9 days earlier and had already turned the country upside down. None of them knew, as they gathered under the harsh gym lights, that they were meeting their equals. None of them understood that history was watching, camera in hand, ready to preserve this moment forever. The gym was cramped and hot, the Miami sun baking through windows that had been painted over years ago to keep out distractions. The smell of old sweat had soaked into the walls over decades, mixed with leather from countless gloves and the sharp tang of liniment that fighters rubbed into their aching muscles. This was a place of work, of discipline, of pain transformed into purpose. And into this temple of boxing walked four boys with mop-top haircuts who had never thrown a serious punch in their lives. Imagine yourself standing in the corner of that gym, the photographers jostling for position, their bulky cameras clicking and whirring, the reporters shouting questions that no one could hear over the chaos. The strange collision of two worlds that should never have intersected, but somehow, on this particular Tuesday afternoon, found themselves sharing the same small space of wooden floors and hanging heavy bags. According to those who were there, the meeting almost didn't happen. The Beatles' manager, Brian Epstein, had originally arranged for them to meet Sonny Liston, the reigning champion, the most fearsome man in boxing, the one everyone expected to destroy Clay in a few days' time. Liston was the favorite. Liston was the star. Liston was the safe bet. Meeting Liston made sense from a publicity standpoint, but Liston had refused. He wanted nothing to do with these long-haired boys from England, these musicians who were causing teenage girls to scream and faint and behave in ways that seemed almost unholy. He couldn't understand why anyone would waste time on such nonsense when there was a serious fight to prepare for. These Beatles, whatever they were, had nothing to do with the real world of boxing. So the Beatles came to Clay instead. And Clay, unlike Liston, understood exactly what he was looking at. He saw himself. Close your eyes and feel the energy in that room, the excitement that crackles when youth and talent and destiny gather in the same place. The camera flashes popping like small explosions of light. The laughter that came easy because none of them had yet learned the weight that fame would eventually bring. They were all still young enough to believe that success would only bring joy, that the world would give without taking, that the spotlight would warm without burning. The Beatles had arrived in America on February 7th, stepping off a Pan Am flight into a wall of screaming that they could barely comprehend. They had appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show 2 days later, watched by 73 million Americans, the largest television audience in history at that time. Everywhere they went, crowds gathered. Police struggled to maintain order. Young girls wept at the mere sight of them. And now they were here, in a sweaty gym in Miami, about to meet a young boxer who was generating his own kind of hysteria, though of a very different sort. "Hello there, Beatles!" Clay shouted as they entered, his voice filling the gym the way it filled every space he entered, bouncing off the walls and the heavy bags and the ring ropes. "We ought to do some road shows together. We'll get rich!" The Beatles laughed, genuine laughter that cut through the noise of the photographers. They were used to being the loudest people in any room, the center of every gathering, the ones around whom all energy orbited. But Clay was giving them competition. Here was someone whose personality was just as large as theirs, whose confidence was just as absolute, whose hunger for attention was just as insatiable. John Lennon, never one to be outdone, never one to cede the spotlight without a fight, shot back with his own quip about boxers and musicians. Ringo grinned his gap-toothed grin, happy to be along for the ride, as he always was. Paul charmed everyone within reach, his natural diplomacy smoothing any rough edges. George, the quiet one, hung back and watched with amused detachment, observing everything while saying little. They were all so young. Clay had not yet become Ali. He had not yet converted to Islam, not yet changed his name, not yet refused to fight in Vietnam, not yet been stripped of his title and exiled from boxing for 3.5 years. The Beatles had not yet made Rubber Soul or Revolver or Sgt. Pepper. They had not yet experimented with drugs or meditation or the avant-garde. They had not yet broken up, had not yet scattered into solo careers of varying success, had not yet watched John die on a New York sidewalk with 5 bullets in his body. They were all still becoming, still forming, still innocent in ways that fame would soon erode. The world had not yet taught them its harder lessons, but the cameras were rolling, and the moment demanded performance. Let your breathing slow as you watch them circle each other. These 5 young men at the beginning of everything. The photographers wanted action, wanted something memorable, wanted a picture that would sell newspapers and make front pages, and justify the expense of sending them to this sweaty gym. And Clay, ever the showman, always aware of how to give people what they wanted while getting what he needed in return, was happy to provide. "Get in the ring," he told them, gesturing toward the canvas square that dominated the center of the gym. "All 4 of you. Come on, come on. Let's see what you got." They climbed through the ropes awkwardly, laughing at themselves, at the absurdity of the situation, at the strangeness of finding themselves in a boxing ring wearing suits and Cuban-heeled boots. 4 musicians who probably couldn't throw a proper jab between them, standing on canvas that had absorbed the blood and sweat of countless fighters, facing a man whose fists were registered as lethal weapons. "You guys ain't as pretty as me," Clay announced, dancing around them with that shuffle that would become famous, his feet barely seeming to touch the ground. "But that's okay. Nobody's as pretty as me." "You're not that pretty," John shot back. "I've seen prettier." The gym erupted in laughter. The photographers clicked furiously. This was exactly the kind of moment they had hoped for. This collision of egos and talents. This spark of genuine chemistry between strangers. And then Clay started throwing phantom punches. Not real ones, of course. Pulled punches. Showman's punches. Theatrical gestures that stopped inches from their targets. But the Beatles, understanding instinctively how to play along, how to give the cameras what they wanted, fell down in sequence like dominoes at a county fair. One by one they collapsed. John first, clutching his jaw as if he'd been hit by a freight train. Then Paul, spinning dramatically before crumpling to the canvas. George went down with a look of surprised dignity. And finally Ringo, who threw himself backward with such theatrical abandon that even Clay broke character and laughed. 4 mop-tops sprawled across the canvas, while Clay stood over them with his arms raised in victory, that famous smile blazing across his face like a spotlight, his eyes bright with the joy of performance. Picture that image now, burned into history by a dozen camera flashes. It would become one of the most reproduced photographs of the 1960s, appearing in books and magazines and documentaries for decades to come. 5 young men who were about to conquer the world, frozen in a moment of pure play, before any of them knew what conquest would cost. The photographers went wild. This was exactly what they needed. This was gold. This was the kind of image that would define an era. But between the posed shots, between the performances and the quips and the theatrical knockdowns, something more genuine was happening. Clay and the Beatles were actually talking, actually connecting, recognizing in each other a kind of ambition and hunger that most people could never understand. Breathe deeply now, and feel the warmth of that connection forming. The cameras pulled back for a moment. The reporters stopped shouting, and in that brief pause, 5 young men looked at each other and saw something familiar. According to witnesses who were close enough to hear, Clay asked them about their music, about England, about what it felt like to have girls screaming their names wherever they went. He wanted to know if it was real, this Beatlemania thing, or if it was just hype cooked up by managers and record companies. He wanted to know if they actually believed they were as good as everyone said. The Beatles asked him about boxing, about Liston, about whether he was scared to face a man who had destroyed every opponent he'd ever faced. They wanted to know if the bragging was real or just an act for the cameras. They wanted to know if he actually believed he could win. "I'm not scared of anything," Clay told them, and his voice was different now, lower and more serious. "But I'll tell you something. Everybody thinks Liston is going to kill me. Everybody. All the experts, all the writers, everybody who thinks they know boxing. They look at me and they see a loud kid who talks too much. They don't see what I see when I look in the mirror." "What do you see?" Paul asked. "The next heavyweight champion of the world." The gym was quiet for a moment. The Beatles looked at him, these 4 young men who had their own impossible dreams and had somehow made them come true, and they recognized something in his eyes. It was the same thing they saw when they looked at each other. Absolute certainty, unshakable belief, the kind of confidence that either makes you a legend or destroys you completely. "We thought we were crazy," John said, "thinking we could come to America and make it here. Everyone told us it was impossible. British bands don't break America, they said. It's never been done." "How's that working out for you?" Clay asked. John smiled that crooked smile. "We're doing all right." Let yourself drift into that moment of connection. Even the greatest can feel alone in their greatness. Even the most celebrated can feel misunderstood by the very people who celebrate them. But in that room, on that day, 5 young men looked at each other and saw reflections of their own impossible ambitions. They talked about fame, about the strange experience of being recognized everywhere they went, about the loss of privacy that came with success. They talked about the people who doubted them, the critics who dismissed them, the experts who explained why they would never achieve what they had already achieved. They talked about being underestimated. The Beatles had been told that their music was too simple, too commercial, too focused on teenage girls to ever be taken seriously. Clay had been told that his style was too unorthodox, his defense too porous, his chin too vulnerable to ever survive against a real puncher like Liston. And they had all decided, independently and identically, to prove the doubters wrong. "You're not as dumb as you look," John Lennon told Clay, that famous Lennon wit cutting through the moment with surgical precision. "No," Clay replied without missing a beat, "but you are." They laughed. Everyone laughed. The gym echoed with it. This sound of joy from people who had every reason to be joyful, who had not yet learned the darker lessons that fame would teach them all in time. Close your eyes and hear that laughter. Let it wash over you like warm water. There is something precious about joy that doesn't know what's coming, about happiness that hasn't yet been tested by tragedy. That gym, on that afternoon, was full of a kind of light that would never shine quite the same way again. The encounter lasted perhaps 45 minutes in total, though time seemed to move strangely in that space. Then the Beatles had somewhere else to be, another interview, another appearance, another station on their endless tour of American attention. The machinery of Beatlemania was relentless, and it had schedules to keep. They climbed out of the ring, straightening their suits, running fingers through their mop-top hair. Handshakes were exchanged, genuine ones, not just the perfunctory grip and grin of celebrities meeting for cameras. These were handshakes between people who had recognized something in each other, who had made a connection that transcended the absurdity of their meeting. "You're gonna beat him," John told Clay as they prepared to leave. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, offered with the confidence of someone who knew something about defying expectations. "I know," Clay replied. "The world just doesn't know it yet." "They'll learn," Paul added. "They always do." And then they were gone, back into the chaos of their American invasion, surrounded by handlers and security guards and the endless tide of screaming fans. Their car pulled away from the 5th Street gym, and within minutes they were consumed by the machinery that had brought them to Miami in the first place. Listen now to the silence after they departed. The photographers packing up their equipment, already mentally composing the captions they would write. The reporters hurrying off to file their stories, racing deadlines that couldn't wait. The gym settling back into its normal rhythms. The jump ropes beginning their steady percussion. The heavy bags resuming their swaying dance under the fists of other fighters. Clay shadowboxed alone for a while after everyone left, working through combinations in front of the mirror, his reflection throwing punches back at him. His mind was perhaps still on the strange visitors who had just passed through his world, or perhaps already moving forward, to the fight with Liston, to the moment when he would shock the world by defeating the most feared man in boxing. Angelo Dundee, his trainer, watched from across the gym but said nothing. He had learned when to talk and when to let his fighter think. And right now, Clay was clearly thinking. "Those boys are going to be big," Clay said finally, still moving, still throwing combinations at the air. "Bigger than anyone realizes." "They're already pretty big," Dundee replied. "Bigger than that. They're going to change everything. I can feel it." He stopped moving and looked at his reflection. A young man stared back at him, handsome and confident, on the edge of something enormous. "So am I," he said to the mirror. "So am I." Imagine now the days that followed. The Beatles continued their American tour, playing concerts and giving interviews and driving young girls to hysterics. And Clay continued his preparation for Liston, training with the focus and intensity that would soon make him a champion. On February 25th, 1 week after the meeting in the gym, Cassius Clay defeated Sonny Liston to become the heavyweight champion of the world. Liston, complaining of a shoulder injury, refused to come out for the 7th round. The impossible had happened. The loud kid who talked too much had done exactly what he said he would do. And watching from somewhere, perhaps on a television in a hotel room between tour stops, 4 young men from Liverpool smiled. They knew. They had seen it in his eyes a week earlier, that same impossible certainty that drove them all forward. The photograph of Clay standing over the fallen Beatles was published around the world in the following days. It appeared on front pages and in magazines. This image of 5 young men playing at combat, laughing at destiny, unaware of everything that was coming for them. Over the years that followed, their paths would rarely cross again. They lived in different worlds, moved in different circles, chased different dreams. But they remained connected by that afternoon in Miami, by the memory of a meeting that had seemed like mere publicity, but had somehow been more. Close your eyes and let the years unspool. Clay became Ali and shook the world with his fists and his convictions. He refused to fight in Vietnam and lost everything, then won it all back in the jungles of Zaire. He lit the Olympic flame with trembling hands and showed the world that greatness transcends the body. He became, as he had always claimed, the greatest. The Beatles became the most influential band in history. They released albums that redefined what popular music could be. They grew beards and found gurus, and eventually grew apart, breaking up in 1970 in a storm of lawsuits and recriminations. John was killed in 1980. George died of cancer in 2001. Paul and Ringo continue on, carrying the weight of legend into old age. But once, before any of that, they were just 5 young men in a gym, laughing, playing, recognizing in each other the same wild spark. Let yourself drift towards sleep now, carrying that image with you. The canvas of the boxing ring, the painted-over windows, the smell of sweat and leather, and 5 voices raised in laughter, not knowing and not needing to know what the future would bring. Some moments exist outside of time. Some connections transcend the circumstances that created them. 5 young men met in a gym in Miami in 1964. And for a few minutes, before fame taught them its harder lessons, they were simply alive together. That is the gift they gave each other. That is the gift they give us still. Sleep now. The gym is quiet. The cameras have stopped. The laughter has faded into memory. But somewhere, in the space between history and dream, 5 young men are still there, still laughing, still young, still absolutely certain that the world is theirs for the taking. And maybe, just maybe, they were right.